That isn't a suggestion, Mr. Renner. It's a final notice. You have 14 days to remove that collection of scrap metal from your property, or the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association will begin fining you $500 a day. After 30 days, we will place a lien against your house and initiate foreclosure proceedings. We have a standard to maintain, and your junkyard is single-handedly destroying the aesthetic and financial value of this entire community. Karen adjusted the strained fabric of her floral print blouse, her voice a weaponized blend of saccharine condescension and bureaucratic threat. She stood on my lawn, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her very presence a violation of the quiet morning air. The sun glinted off the chrome fender of the half-restored '67 Mustang in my driveway, the car I had been painstakingly rebuilding in memory of my late wife, Sarah. To Karen, it was scrap. To me, it was the last piece of a promise. Her eyes, small and hard, flickered from the Mustang to the covered shell of a '55 Bel Air in the side yard. Her lips pursed in a permanent state of disapproval. I could feel the gazes of my neighbors from behind their perfectly manicured hedges and twitching curtains, the air thick with the unspoken tension she cultivated like a prize-winning rose bush. This wasn't about the cars, and we both knew it. It was about control, about her insatiable need to bend every resident to her will, and I, a retired Army colonel who had refused to ask permission to plant my own damn garden, was her prize target. The sheer audacity of threatening to take my home, the home I'd paid for with 30 years of service to my country, over a hobby that violated no city or county ordinance, ignited a cold fire in my gut. But I had learned long ago in places far more dangerous than this manicured suburb that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. I simply held her gaze, my face a mask of calm I did not feel, and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for her. She expected me to yell, to argue, to give her the fight she so clearly craved. I would not give her the satisfaction. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we get into how I dealt with this HOA tyrant, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, I want to hear about it. It's amazing how a little bit of power can turn a neighbor into a neighborhood dictator. Now back to Karen and her little kingdom. She finally huffed, her sense of dramatic timing failing her. 14 days, Mr. Renner. The clock is ticking. She turned with a flourish and marched back across my lawn, leaving the scent of cheap perfume and entitlement in her wake. I watched her go, then looked back at Sarah's Mustang. The clock wasn't just ticking for me, it was ticking for her. She had just declared war on a man who had spent his life mastering the rules of engagement, and she had made a critical, fatal error. She had severely underestimated her opponent. She had no idea who I was, what I did for a living now, or just how sharp the teeth were on the very laws she loved to weaponize. She thought this was her battlefield. She was about to find out it was my courtroom. After Sarah passed, the silence in our home became a physical weight. The four walls I'd once associated with laughter and warmth felt like a mausoleum. My daughters were grown, with families of their own in other states, and my retirement from the Army felt less like a reward and more like an exile. I had spent 3 decades in a world of rigid structure, purpose, and camaraderie. Civilian life, especially alone, was disorienting. The cars were Sarah's idea, a project we were supposed to tackle together in our golden years. She'd loved the classics. They have stories, she'd say, running her hand over a faded photograph of a Bel Air. Not like these new plastic things. After she was gone, I found the old photos and the list she'd made. At the top was a '67 Mustang Fastback, just like the one her father had. Finding it took 6 months. It was a rust-pocked shell in a farmer's field, but the frame was true. Dragging it home on a flatbed was the first time I'd felt a flicker of purpose since the funeral. I poured myself into the work. The methodical process of stripping away the rust, sourcing original parts, the smell of grease and oil, the satisfaction of a perfectly torqued bolt. It was therapy. It was a way to keep my hands busy and my mind from drifting into the dark. Soon the Mustang was joined by the '55 Bel Air, a beautiful boat of a car that was more of a long-term dream. They sat on my property, one in the open driveway where I worked on it under a heavy-duty car cover when I wasn't actively sanding or priming, and the other tucked away beside the garage, also under a thick, custom-fit cover. They were my projects, my connection to her, and they were compliant with every single city and county code. I lived on a half-acre lot, set back from the road, and my nearest neighbor was a good 100 feet away. I kept my lawn immaculate, my tools neatly stored, and never worked past sundown. I was, by all accounts, a quiet, unobtrusive neighbor. But Oak Haven Estates was not a normal neighborhood. It was a fiefdom, and Karen Miller was its self-appointed queen. My first encounter with her was 2 weeks after I moved in. She appeared at my door with a welcome basket containing a single dry muffin and a 3-inch thick binder of HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. "Welcome to the community, Colonel Renner," she'd said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain standard here. I trust you'll find this binder to be your new Bible." The undertone was clear. This wasn't a welcome, it was a warning. Over the next year, the warnings became citations. A notice for my garden hose being visible from the street for more than 4 hours. A violation for my trash bins being put out at 7 p.m. the night before pickup instead of after 9 p.m. A formal complaint that the flag I flew on my porch, the very flag that had draped a friend's casket, was 2 inches wider than the approved dimensions for decorative banners. Each one I handled with quiet, documented compliance. I'd take a photo of the corrected infraction, email it to the HOA board with a timestamp, and keep a copy in a folder I labeled the Queen's Decrees. I refused to engage her directly, communicating only through formal, dispassionate emails. This, I learned, infuriated her. She wanted arguments, deference, fear. My calm, procedural compliance was like sand in the gears of her power machine. The cars were the final straw. She couldn't stand something she couldn't control, and my quiet passion was an affront to her authority. The first notice called them derelict vehicles. I responded with a polite email, attaching copies of the current registrations for both vehicles and a copy of the county ordinance defining derelict, a definition which required a vehicle to be in a state of visible disrepair and have expired tags. Since my tags were current, her definition was legally irrelevant. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. It was just the beginning. The formal, final notice she delivered to my lawn was a declaration that she was no longer bound by mere reason or law. She was operating on the pure, uncut fuel of her own ego, and she was escalating this conflict to a place where she believed her power was absolute. The certified letters began arriving like clockwork, each one a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. The first fine was $500 as promised. The letter signed by Karen as HOA president cited bylaw 7.14, maintenance of property aesthetics. It was a vague catch-all rule that could mean anything she wanted it to mean. I read the entire HOA binder, her Bible, from cover to cover that night. It was a labyrinth of contradictions and legally dubious clauses, likely cobbled together from various online templates without any real legal review. The section on vehicles prohibited commercial trucks, ERVs, and boats from being parked in driveways overnight. It said nothing about vehicles under restoration, provided they were registered and operable, or in a state of being made operable. My Mustang, with its engine half rebuilt, clearly fell into the latter category. I drafted a formal response, not an email this time, but a typed letter sent via certified mail, return receipt requested. In it, I respectfully disagreed with the board's interpretation of bylaw 7.14, quoted the specific county ordinances that superseded the HOA's vague language, and attached again the valid registrations for both vehicles. I stated that I was in full compliance with all governing statutes and that the fines were being levied without legal basis. I requested a formal hearing with the full HOA board to discuss the matter, as was my right under the association's own rules. I was building a paper trail, a fortress of documentation. Every interaction, every letter, every threat was cataloged in my binder, which was growing thicker by the day. I knew from my military career that battles are often won long before the first shot is fired, in the tedious, meticulous work of planning and preparation. Karen's world was one of bluster and intimidation. My world was one of evidence and procedure. The board granted my request for a hearing held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and desperation. The board consisted of Karen and two other residents, a meek retired accountant named Arthur, who looked terrified of his own shadow, and a woman named Brenda who seemed to be Karen's loyal lady-in-waiting, nodding at everything she said. It wasn't a hearing, it was a show trial. I presented my case calmly and logically, laying out the legal codes and the lack of any specific prohibition in their own bylaws. I spoke for 10 minutes, presenting my binder of evidence. Karen let me finish, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She didn't even look at her fellow board members. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Renner," she said, the word presentation dripping with disdain. "However, the Aesthetics Committee, which I chair, has determined that your vehicles constitute a visual nuisance. The board's decision to fine you stands. The fines are now at $3,000. You will pay them, and you will remove the cars." Arthur wouldn't meet my eyes. Brenda was nodding vigorously. It was then I understood the depth of her control. The board was not a democratic body. It was a rubber stamp for her whims. I stood up, gathered my papers, and looked directly at her. "This decision is arbitrary and capricious," I said, my voice low and even. "It is not based on the governing documents of this association or the laws of this county. You are acting outside the scope of your authority, and I will not be paying these illegal fines." The humor of the situation, dark as it was, began to settle in. Here was a woman who worshipped rules, yet she was breaking them with impunity. She was so drunk on her sliver of power that she believed it made her infallible. As I walked out of the clubhouse, I heard her call after me, her voice shrill with fury. "You'll regret this. I will see to it that you are removed from this community. I'll have you know I have friends in the county government." The threat hung in the air, but it didn't frighten me. It gave me my next move. She was about to escalate this beyond her little kingdom of manicured lawns and petty tyrannies. She was going to take her fight to a bigger stage, an arena with very different rules and a very different kind of authority. And in doing so, she was unknowingly handing me the very weapon I needed to dismantle her entire empire. The next certified letter wasn't a fine, it was a notice of intent to file a lien. The total was now over $10,000. She was moving faster than I expected, driven by pure spite, but her mention of friends in the county government was the key. She was about to make a very, very big mistake. True to her word, Karen's next move was to escalate beyond the HOA. About a week after the show trial, I received a thick envelope from the county. It wasn't from the courts, but from the Code Enforcement Division. Inside was a formal notice of complaint and a scheduled inspection of my property. My eyes scanned the document, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. She'd actually done it. She had taken her petty neighborhood squabble and turned it into an official county matter. The complaint itself was a work of fiction, a testament to Karen's boundless imagination and malice. The list of alleged violations was breathtaking in its absurdity. She hadn't just reported junk cars. She had accused me of running an unlicensed auto repair business from my home, a clear zoning violation. She claimed the vehicles were leaking hazardous fluids, including gasoline, oil, and antifreeze, directly into the soil, posing an imminent threat to the local water table. She alleged that the cars were attracting vermin and vagrants, creating a public health crisis. The complaint finished with a flourish, describing my property as a blight that was actively causing property values in Oakhaven Estates to plummet. She had signed it Karen Miller on behalf of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association and as a concerned citizen. She had put her name and the HOA's name on a legal document filled with slanderous, easily disprovable lies. This was no longer a simple dispute over aesthetics. This was defamation. She had just handed me a loaded gun. I spent the next few days preparing for the inspection, but not by cleaning up or hiding anything. Instead, I prepared my evidence. I gathered the receipts for every part I'd purchased for the Mustang. I printed out the engineering schematics and my detailed step-by-step restoration plan. I laid out large, clean drip pans under both cars, even though neither was leaking a single drop of anything. I photographed the pans each morning and evening, creating a time-stamped visual record proving the absence of any hazardous leaks. I bought a small professional-grade soil testing kit and took samples from around and under the vehicles, documenting the process on video before sending the samples to a lab for an official analysis. I even set up a motion-activated wildlife camera aimed at the side yard. Over 3 nights, it captured footage of a raccoon, 3 squirrels, and my neighbor's cat, but not a single vagrant. The binder I had started for the HOA was now supplemented by a new, much more serious one labeled County Complaint Response. On the day of the inspection, I was ready. A white county truck pulled into my driveway precisely at the scheduled time. A man in a crisp uniform shirt with a county code enforcement patch on the sleeve stepped out. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a tired but professional demeanor. He'd seen it all, and the weary set of his eyes told me he was not looking forward to mediating another neighborhood war. "Mr. Renner?" he asked, extending a hand. "I'm David Ortiz, with Code Enforcement. We received a complaint regarding your property." "I know," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "I received a copy. Please come in. I'll show you whatever you need to see." I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He was used to hostility, defensiveness, people trying to hide things. My open, calm welcome seemed to disarm him. As I led him toward the driveway, I saw it, the subtle twitch of the curtains in Karen's living room window across the street. She was watching, no doubt savoring what she imagined was my imminent downfall, picturing the inspector slapping me with massive fines and condemnation notices. The image of her smugly peering from her window, so confident in her victory, was a powerful motivator. I walked Mr. Ortiz through every single allegation in Karen's complaint, systematically and dispassionately dismantling each one with documented proof. "The complaint alleges an unlicensed business," I began. "Here are my military pension statements and my current employment contract. My income is fully accounted for. This is a hobby, not a business." I then showed him the cars. I pulled back the cover on the Mustang first. This is a 1967 Mustang Fastback. It was my wife's dream car. I am restoring it in her memory. Here is the valid registration. Here are the engineering schematics. Here is my project plan. I pointed to the engine bay. As you can see, the engine is clean. There are no active fluid lines connected. Regardless, you can see the absorbent mat I've placed underneath, as well as the industrial drip pan. Both are bone dry, as they have been every day. We moved to the Bel Air, and I repeated the process. I showed him the soil analysis report from the lab, which came back completely clean. I showed him the wildlife camera footage. By the time I was finished, Mr. Ortiz was shaking his head slowly, a look of profound annoyance on his face. An annoyance directed not at me, but at the person who had wasted his time. He had a whole county of actual problems to deal with, and he just spent an hour on a complaint that was, to put it mildly, malicious fiction. He made a few notes on his clipboard, his pen strokes sharp and angry. He was all business, but I could sense the shift in his perspective. He knew what was going on here. He had seen this story 100 times before. The official report from the County Code Enforcement Division arrived in my mailbox a week later. It was a single page, a beautiful, sterile document of bureaucratic vindication. For each of Karen's hysterical allegations, unlicensed business, hazardous waste, vermin infestation, public nuisance, the findings were the same, unfounded. The case was officially closed. A copy, I knew, would also be sent to the complainant. I could almost picture the moment Karen opened that letter, her smug anticipation curdling into indignant rage. Her grand maneuver, her appeal to a higher authority, had blown up in her face. She had tried to use the county as a weapon, and the weapon had refused to fire. I allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction, sitting at my kitchen table with the letter, the morning sun warming the polished wood. But my satisfaction wasn't just about being proven right. It was about what came next. Karen's complaint had been an act of hubris, a massive overreach born from her belief that the system was designed to serve her will. In doing so, she had moved our conflict from the petty, insulated world of the HOA into the formal, interconnected world of county governance. My world. I had retired from the Army as a colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the military's legal arm. I had spent the last 5 years of my service as a military judge. When I retired, I hadn't wanted to stop working. A friend on the county commission, aware of my background, had suggested I apply for an open position as a county magistrate judge. It was a part-time appointed position, dealing mostly with administrative law, traffic violations, small claims, and, most importantly, reviewing and signing off on zoning variances, land use permits, and construction applications. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a way to serve the community and keep my mind sharp. My name on the court documents was Michael T. Renner. To the neighborhood, I was just Mike Renner, the quiet retired Army guy who kept to himself. I never discussed my job. I enjoyed the anonymity. Karen, in her obsessive quest to know everything about everyone, had clearly only done the most superficial research. She saw a military pension and assumed I was just another retiree tinkering in his garage. She had no idea that her friends in the county government were, in some cases, my direct colleagues, or that the very permits her precious HOA needed for any significant project would eventually have to cross my desk. The thought had been percolating in the back of my mind since her threat at the clubhouse. But now, with her official failed complaint, the path forward became crystal clear. She had created an official record of her harassment. She had documented her own malice. I walked into my home office and logged into the county's public records portal. I searched for any pending applications or permits filed by the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association. And there it was, filed just 2 weeks prior. Application for zoning variance and construction permit, Project ID 774-B, applicant Oak Haven Estates HOA. Project description, construction of new 5,000 square feet community clubhouse and Olympic-sized swimming pool complex. Estimated cost, $2.5 million. It was her legacy project, the jewel in her crown she had been promising residents for years. And at the bottom of the application summary was the final, beautiful detail. Scheduled for a review and preliminary approval hearing. Date, October 26th. Presiding magistrate, Judge M.T. Renner. A cold, predatory calm settled over me. She had brought the war to me, but she had chosen a battlefield where I wasn't just a soldier. I was the commanding general. She had no idea who she was about to face. She was walking into my courtroom, asking for my approval, after having formally and falsely accused me of being a public menace. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I leaned back in my chair, the plan already forming in my mind. I wasn't going to recuse myself. There was no legal conflict of interest. My dispute was with the HOA president in her official capacity, not with the merit of the application itself, at least not yet. My duty as a magistrate was to evaluate the application based on county law and the fitness of the applicant. And I was about to conduct the most thorough evaluation of Karen Miller's fitness that she could ever imagine. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for her to walk into it. The first step was to ensure the battle was not mine alone. Karen's reign of terror had been long and wide-ranging. I couldn't be the only resident she had targeted. A tyrant's power relies on isolating their victims, making each one feel like they are the only one, that the problem is with them and not the system. It was time to build an alliance. I started with a quiet walk around the neighborhood. I spoke to Bob, a retired firefighter 2 streets over, who had been fined for his meticulously maintained vegetable garden, which Karen had deemed agricultural in nature and not in keeping with the community's ornamental aesthetic. I talked to the Lees, a young couple who had received a violation notice for the small plastic slide their 4-year-old daughter used in the backyard, claiming it was an unapproved permanent structure. Then there was Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow whose small dog had been declared a nuisance for barking at a squirrel, resulting in a series of escalating fines she was struggling to pay on her fixed income. Each story was the same. A minor, fabricated infraction met with an iron fist of disproportionate punishment. Each person had tried to fight, had been shut down by Karen's rubber stamp board, and had eventually given up, choosing to pay the fine or remove the offending garden gnome just to make the harassment stop. They were beaten down and resigned. When I told them my story about the cars, the fraudulent county complaint, and the upcoming hearing, a spark of hope ignited in their eyes. For the first time, they realized they weren't alone. I didn't tell them I was the presiding judge. That was my ace in the hole. I simply framed it as a public hearing, a chance for concerned citizens to voice their opinions on whether the HOA, under its current leadership, could be trusted to manage a multi-million-dollar construction project. Her pattern of behavior is relevant, I explained, sitting in Bob's living room, a stack of his violation notices on the coffee table between us. If she is mismanaging funds, harassing residents, and selectively enforcing rules on a small scale, how can the county trust her to oversee a $2.5 million project that will affect all of our property values and community funds? My next call was to David Morrison, an old friend from my JAG Corps days. Dave was a bulldog of a litigator who had left the Army a few years after me and started his own private practice. He specialized in civil law and had a particular fondness for going after bullies. I laid out the whole situation for him over the phone, from the first notice about my garden hose to the fraudulent county complaint and the upcoming hearing for the pool permit. He was silent for a long moment, and then he let out a low whistle. "Mike, this is beautiful," he said, the glee evident in his voice. "This isn't just an HOA dispute. This woman has opened herself up to a world of legal pain, defamation, malicious prosecution, abusive process. It's a target-rich environment." "I don't want to sue her, Dave," I said. "Not yet. I want to stop her. I want to use the system she loves to worship against her. I need you to represent a newly formed group, the Oak Haven Residents for Responsible Governance. You won't be representing me. You'll be representing Bob, the Lees, Mrs. Gable, and a half dozen others." Dave understood immediately. "So I'm the voice of the people. I present their documented grievances at the permit hearing, questioning the HOA's character and fitness as an applicant. And you just happen to be the judge on the bench, impartially weighing the evidence presented?" "Exactly," I said. "It has to be by the book. No ex parte communication, no appearance of impropriety. You will present a case based on facts and evidence. I will rule based on the law and the information presented in my courtroom. Karen is the one who has intertwined her personal vendettas with official HOA business. We're just going to give her the public forum she deserves to explain it." We spent the next 2 weeks preparing. Dave drafted official statements from each of the wrong neighbors, complete with copies of their violation notices, photos, and records of their attempts to resolve the issues. We dug into the HOA's financial disclosures, which were public record. We found irregularities almost immediately: exorbitant fees paid to a landscaping company owned by Karen's brother-in-law, questionable administrative expenses, and a reserve fund that was suspiciously underfunded for an association planning such a massive capital expenditure. The trap wasn't just about my personal grievance anymore. It was about liberating an entire community. Karen thought her power came from her clipboard and her binder of rules. She was about to learn that true power comes from the truth, meticulously documented and presented in a form where her bluster and intimidation meant absolutely nothing. The day before the hearing, I took a walk past her house. She was in her front yard directing the placement of a new, ostentatiously large fountain. She saw me, and her face tightened into a mask of pure loathing. She thought I was a defeated man, a nuisance she had successfully swatted away. She had no idea that I was the architect of her impending doom, and that tomorrow in a small wood-paneled room in the county courthouse, her reign was coming to a definitive and public end. The courtroom was small and unassuming, smelling of old paper and floor wax. It was designed for administrative hearings, not high drama, which made the tension in the air all the more palpable. I sat on the raised dais, clad in my simple black robe, looking out over the handful of people in the gallery. My face was impassive, my posture erect, the perfect picture of judicial neutrality. In the front row sat Dave Morrison, my old friend, looking sharp and serious in a dark suit, a thick binder on the table in front of him. Beside him were Bob, the Lees, and Mrs. Gable, their faces a mixture of nervousness and defiant hope. On the other side of the aisle sat Karen, flanked by the HOA's lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Peterson, who looked like he'd rather be on a golf course. Karen herself was beaming. She was dressed in a bright pink power suit, a conqueror arriving to claim her prize. She surveyed the room with an air of ownership, nodding condescendingly to a few people she recognized. She glanced at the bench, saw me, and her eyes registered nothing. To her, I was just another faceless bureaucrat, a cog in the machine that was about to grant her everything she wanted. She had never seen me in anything but old jeans and a t-shirt, covered in grease. Out of my natural habitat, I was invisible to her. The clerk called the court to order. All rise, the Court of Magistrate Judge Michael T. Renner is now in session. I watched Karen's face as the clerk said my name. It was a moment of pure cinematic perfection. Her broad, confident smile didn't just falter, it collapsed. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Her eyes widened, flicking from me to the nameplate on the bench and back again, the gears in her mind grinding, trying to process the impossible reality. She looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time, she saw me. The retired Army guy, the man with the junk cars, the public menace she had reported to the county, and he was the judge. Her lawyer Peterson, who had been shuffling papers, looked up at her, confused by her sudden pallor. He followed her horrified gaze to me, and a wave of professional panic washed over his face. He leaned in and whispered frantically to her, but she could only shake her head, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and even, resonating with the quiet authority of the room. "We are here today to hear Case 774B, the application by the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association for a zoning variance and construction permit. Mr. Peterson, are you ready to present your case for the applicant?" Peterson shot to his feet, flustered. Your Honor, may we have a moment? There appears to be a potential conflict of interest here that we were not aware of." "A conflict, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Please enlighten me. My only legal requirement for recusal would be a direct financial interest in the outcome of this case or a close familial relationship with one of the parties. I have neither. My residency in the community is a matter of public record. Your client's failure to perform basic due diligence on the presiding magistrate for her $2.5 million project is not grounds for a delay." The legal language was a sharp, clean blow. I had just told him, in the politest way possible, that his and his client's incompetence was their problem, not mine. He stammered, looking helplessly at Karen, who seemed to have shrunk inside her pink suit. "Proceed with your presentation, counselor," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. For the next 20 minutes, Peterson stumbled through a canned presentation about the benefits of the new pool and clubhouse. He spoke of community engagement, increased property values, and quality of life. He was a decent lawyer, but his heart wasn't in it. He knew he was in a minefield, and his client, the person who was supposed to be his guide, was in a state of catatonic shock. When he finished, I turned my attention to the other table. "Does anyone wish to speak in opposition to this application?" Dave Morrison stood up, his movements crisp and confident. "Yes, Your Honor, David Morrison, on behalf of the Oak Haven residents for responsible governance. We are not here today to argue against the idea of a new pool. We are here to argue that this specific applicant, the Oak Haven Estates HOA under its current leadership, has demonstrated a pattern of behavior that makes it fundamentally unfit to be granted the public trust and the financial and legal responsibility that comes with a project of this magnitude." Karen's head snapped up. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a surge of pure, undiluted fury. She glared at Dave, then at the neighbor sitting beside him, her eyes promising retribution. But her glares had no power here. Her kingdom was a few miles away. This room was mine. "Mr. Morrison, you may proceed," I said, my voice a flat, neutral instrument of the law. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, giving my full attention to the man I'd spent the last 2 weeks preparing for this exact moment. The trap was no longer being set. The spring had been triggered, and Karen was caught squarely in its jaws. Dave began not with an argument, but with a story. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce you to Robert Patterson," he said, gesturing to Bob, the retired firefighter. Bob, a man who had run into burning buildings for a living, looked terrified but resolute as he was sworn in. Dave gently guided him through his testimony. "Mr. Patterson, could you please describe for the court your experience with the Oak Haven HOA's Aesthetics Committee?" Bob detailed the years of pride he took in his vegetable garden, how it was a source of fresh food for his family and several elderly neighbors. Then he described the violation notices, the fines, and the final humiliating order from Karen to rip it all out because it didn't fit her vision of a perfect suburban landscape. Dave submitted the HOA letters and photos of the beautiful, thriving garden as Exhibit A. Next came the Lees. The young couple described the joy on their daughter's face when they bought her the small plastic slide, and the subsequent threatening letter from the HOA classifying it as an unapproved structure. They talked about the stress and anxiety it caused, how they felt watched and judged in their own backyard. Their violation notice became Exhibit B. Then Mrs. Gable took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted the harassment over her small terrier, a companion that was her only comfort after her husband's death. She explained how the fines, levied for the dog's occasional bark, had forced her to choose between paying the HOA and buying her prescription medication. A wave of quiet anger rippled through the gallery. The HOA's lawyer, Peterson, objected feebly. "Your Honor, this is all anecdotal. It has no bearing on a zoning application." "On the contrary, Mr. Peterson," I countered, my voice sharp. "The county grants zoning variances and permits based not only on the merits of the project, but on the applicant's demonstrated capacity for responsible management. Mr. Morrison is presenting evidence that speaks directly to the character, judgment, and management practices of the HOA's leadership. The objection is overruled." I saw Karen whisper furiously to Peterson, but he just shook his head, knowing it was a losing battle. Dave then pivoted from the emotional to the financial. "Your Honor, we have also conducted a review of the HOA's publicly available financial statements, and we have found several troubling irregularities we believe are relevant to their fitness to manage a $2.5 million construction budget." He called a forensic accountant, a friend of Dave's who had donated his time, to the stand. The accountant laid out a damning case. He detailed the no-bid contract awarded to Evergreen Landscaping, the company owned by Karen's brother-in-law, for a price nearly 40% higher than market rate. He highlighted over $50,000 in vague administrative and legal consulting fees paid out over the last year with no itemized invoices. Most critically, he showed that the HOA's capital reserve fund was less than half of what was legally required by state law for an association of its size, meaning the special assessment they would need to levy on residents to pay for the new pool would be astronomical and potentially illegal. With every piece of testimony, every exhibit entered into evidence, I watched Karen. Her face went from red to purple. She was being dismantled, piece by piece, in a public forum, according to the very rules and procedures she claimed to hold so dear. The final witness Dave called was a surprise to everyone in the room, including me. It was Arthur, the meek accountant from the HOA board. He shuffled to the stand, avoiding Karen's murderous glare. Under Dave's gentle questioning, Arthur admitted that Karen made all decisions unilaterally, that the board never truly voted, and that he and Brenda were instructed to simply ratify her decrees. He confessed that he had raised concerns about the landscaping contract and the underfunded reserves, but had been threatened by Karen with a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty if he didn't stay silent. It was the final nail in the coffin. The entire edifice of her power, built on bullying and secrecy, had crumbled in the sterile light of my courtroom. When Dave rested his case, I turned to Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, does your client, the applicant, wish to offer any rebuttal to this testimony?" Peterson looked at Karen, who was vibrating with rage. He clearly wanted to cut his losses, but she hissed something at him. He sighed. "The applicant, Ms. Miller, would like to make a statement, Your Honor." "Very well," I said. Karen strode to the podium, her eyes blazing. This was her last stand. She was going to try and bully her way out of this. "This is a travesty," she began, her voice shaking with fury. "A personal vendetta orchestrated by a disgruntled resident. Mr. Renner, you will refer to me as Your Honor in this courtroom, Miss Miller." I cut her off, my voice like ice. She flinched. "Your Honor," she corrected, spitting the words. "This man has a grudge against me because I had the courage to enforce our community standards against his disgusting, rusty cars. This entire proceeding is a sham, a conflict of interest." "Ms. Miller," I said, leaning forward, "let me be very clear. The only evidence before this court of a personal vendetta is the official and ultimately unfounded county complaint you filed against me, which alleged falsely that I was a public menace. You brought our dispute into the county's purview. Today, you are here as an applicant representing an organization seeking a permit. The court has heard extensive testimony from multiple residents and a financial expert detailing a pattern of mismanagement, intimidation, and potential self-dealing on your part. Do you have any evidence, not insults, not accusations, but actual evidence, to refute their claims? She stood there speechless. She had nothing. Her only weapons were bluster and threats, and they were useless here. I see, I said into the silence. I picked up my gavel. Based on the extensive evidence presented today, this court finds that the applicant, the Oak Haven Estates HOA, under its current leadership, has failed to demonstrate the fiscal responsibility, sound judgment, and trustworthy character required to oversee a project of this scale and cost. The application for a zoning variance and construction permit is hereby denied, with prejudice. The words "with prejudice" echoed in the silent room. It meant she couldn't just fix a few things and refile. It was a fatal blow. Furthermore, I continued, looking directly at her, the testimony presented today regarding potential financial malfeasance, including bid rigging and embezzlement of HOA funds, is deeply troubling. This court is therefore referring this entire matter to the County District Attorney's Office for a full criminal investigation. The gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. This court is adjourned. The aftermath was a tidal wave. The news of the permit denial and the impending criminal investigation spread through Oak Haven Estates like a wildfire. My courtroom, a place of quiet administrative proceedings, had become the epicenter of a community revolution. That evening, my phone didn't stop ringing. It was Bob, the Lees, and a dozen other residents I didn't even know, all calling to offer their stunned, grateful thanks. The fear that had blanketed the neighborhood for years had finally lifted. For the first time, people felt empowered to speak up. An emergency HOA meeting was called for by a petition that garnered signatures from over 70% of the homeowners in less than 48 hours. The meeting was held not in the small, sterile clubhouse, but in the local high school auditorium to accommodate the massive crowd. I attended, not as a judge or a leader, but simply as a resident, sitting quietly in the back row. Karen was there, of course. She stood at the front, no longer in her power suit, but in a drab gray outfit, looking haggard and defeated. Her lawyer, Peterson, stood beside her, looking deeply uncomfortable. He was likely only there because his retainer required it. The meeting was brutal. One by one, residents stood up and aired their grievances, their voices shaking with years of pent-up anger and frustration. They spoke of the absurd fines, the constant intimidation, the feeling of being prisoners in their own homes. The stories I had heard were just the tip of the iceberg. Karen's tyranny had been more pervasive than I could have imagined. When the time came for the vote of no confidence in her leadership, the result was a foregone conclusion. It was nearly unanimous. She was stripped of her title as president and removed from the board, effective immediately. Her two cronies, Brenda and Arthur, had already submitted their resignations that morning. As the vote was announced, a cheer erupted through the auditorium. Karen stood there for a moment, her face a thunderous mask of disbelief, before turning and storming out of the auditorium to a chorus of boos. It was a public and complete humiliation, a fitting end to her reign of terror. In her place, the community elected a new board, headed by Bob, the retired firefighter whose garden had started it all. Their first official act, passed by a unanimous vote at that very meeting, was to rescind and refund every single fine levied by Karen's board over the past 2 years. Their second act was to commission a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances, promising complete transparency. The investigation by the district attorney's office, I later learned, uncovered enough evidence of fraud and embezzlement related to the landscaping contract and other consulting fees that Karen and her brother-in-law were both indicted. Facing a mountain of evidence, she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced to 5 years of probation, community service, and ordered to pay over $100,000 in restitution to the HOA. A for sale sign went up in her front yard a week later. I never saw her again. Life in Oak Haven Estates changed almost overnight. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and genuine community. People started talking to each other again. Backyard barbecues replaced violation notices. The new board led by Bob was fair and reasonable, using the bylaws as they were intended, To maintain the community, not to control it. A few months later, on a perfect autumn Saturday, I was in my driveway, the sun warm on my back. The engine for Sarah's Mustang was finally complete, a gleaming monument of chrome and steel. I was carefully lowering it into the engine bay when Bob walked up my driveway, holding 2 bottles of cold beer. "Figured you could use a break, Judge," he said with a grin. I smiled, wiping the grease from my hands. "Mike is fine, Bob, and I definitely could." We sat on the tailgate of my truck, sipping our beers and looking at the car. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with the peaceful sounds of lawnmowers and children playing. The oppressive silence of Karen's rule was gone. "You know," Bob said, "we resubmitted the application for the clubhouse. A smaller one, more affordable. It got approved last week." "I saw that," I said. "Looked like a good plan." "Yeah," he said, taking a long drink. "Funny how things work when you're not trying to build a monument to yourself." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, just 2 neighbors enjoying a beautiful day. I looked at the Mustang, so close to being finished, and felt a profound sense of peace. The cars were never about being a rebel. They were about memory, about purpose, about holding on to a piece of the woman I loved. In the end, my fight with Karen wasn't about the cars either. It was about the simple, fundamental principle that a home should be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. It was about the idea that rules should serve people, not the other way around. I had won, not through anger or aggression, but through patience, preparation, and a deep understanding of the very system my opponent had tried to use against me. I had restored not just a classic car, but a community. And as I looked out over the peaceful neighborhood, I knew with absolute certainty that Sarah would have been proud.